Hello, I'm Ann Kim, a senior editor at Washington Monthly Magazine, and this is the first in an occasional series where we'll be having short conversations with the authors of recent pieces at the Washington Monthly. And today's guest is Washington Monthly's very own Gillian Tenner Martin. Hey, Gillian, great to see you.
Hey, Anne, thanks for having me.
So you've written a piece titled Trump's definition of DEI is a disaster for disaster management. So can you explain a basic argument that you make in your piece?
Yeah, so my thinking around this piece really started when I saw the New York Times list of words and phrases, terms that were disappearing under Trump that agencies in the government are either limiting the use of or wholesale striking from government documents. And this is associated with his DEI rollbacks. So these are things like vulnerable or at risk, marginalized, or even disabilities or discrimination. These
Or even
words are
historically, yeah.
Yes, even historically. So these words are sort of being phased out of use. And coming from a background in local government and in emergency management within local government, I've written these terms into emergency plans myself. And I know that they're necessary to describe a lot of the situation on the ground when it comes to emergencies. There are communities in the US that are more at risk or more vulnerable for disasters, be it based on their geography, whether they're in a fire prone region or a flood prone region, or be it because they are, say, a rural community with limited staff capacity or expertise or ability to access resources to prepare themselves. So different communities have different levels of vulnerability within the US. And then within each community, there's different groups of individuals that are more at risk for disasters. And emergency managers often call this access and functional needs populations. And that's anyone from
Hmm.
folks with disabilities to elderly people to families with young children, people with chronic illnesses, or just people that lack cars or are very poor. These are access and functional needs populations. I'll also say individuals that don't speak English fluently, who need messaging in their own language to understand that they need to evacuate. So there are communities that are more vulnerable, and within every community, groups that are more vulnerable. And we need to plan to meet those vulnerabilities in order to save lives and protect Americans. So that was the base level of my argument, is that his DEI rollbacks are going too far in ways that really jeopardize lives and waste money because government planning that's done well saves money in the cases of disasters.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this, you point out in your piece that we're in this absurd situation where people like Elon Musk are actually blaming DEI for the catastrophic impacts of natural disasters when the real point is that eliminating this focus on vulnerable populations is what's going to make disasters worse. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And my piece doesn't focus exclusively on race. As I point out, I use a lot of data that shows that communities of color, through indisputably inequitable aspects of our history, like redlining or forced relocation of indigenous communities, have pushed communities of color into either more hazardous neighborhoods within their own cities or communities or into generally more hazardous zones or low-lying areas of the country or more fire-prone areas of the country overall. But we need not prioritize federal resources based on race. Prioritizing resources to communities most at risk will benefit communities of color. What we need to focus on when it comes to race is making sure that communities aren't deprived or starved of resources based on discrimination. Because while discrimination is a word on this list of language that's disappearing, it's happened. In 2022, when Jackson, Mississippi's water system failed, it wasn't just because of severe water and severe flooding and weather. It was also because the city had not had the funds to upgrade its water system. And many experts from Human Rights Watch to the EPA found that the state of Mississippi was largely at fault for deprioritizing resources to that community. So we need not prioritize based on race, but we do need to make sure that race as a factor isn't starving communities of the resources they need to prepare.
Right, right. Well, you wrote this piece also in this year, which is the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. So if you could talk about how Hurricane Katrina actually also illustrates your point that appropriate disaster management is wholly incompatible with what Trump has proposed here.
Yeah. So a lot of people call the type of disaster management that someone called inclusive, like whole community preparedness. And Katrina, a lot of people called a man made disaster in many ways because it showed that throughout the planning processes for a storm of this nature that was modeled, that New Orleans and the Gulf Coast knew could come and was coming, they had not prepared for at-risk populations. So at the time that Katrina made landfall, it was estimated that New Orleans residents didn't own a car. They didn't have personal transport to get themselves out of the city. We knew that there were a lot of folks in nursing homes. We knew that there were a lot of folks in hospitals. We knew that there were a lot of people who were just simply elderly or poor. And it was up to the Louisiana Department of Transportation to mobilize evacuation for these populations in the event of a mandatory evacuation order, which happened. There was a mandatory evacuation order, and the Department of Transportation for the state of Louisiana didn't mobilize. In a Senate investigation hearing about the failed evacuation, the Secretary of Transportation actually came out and said, we didn't do that because we'd put no plans in place to do so. And the consequence was that 70% of the people who died in Katrina were over the age of 60, and nearly half, 47%, were over the age of 75. So if you do not plan adequately for at-risk populations, guess what? You're going to see lives lost. And then I think the other thing about Katrina that is sort of being forgotten as a lesson learned here is just the importance of mitigation. Emergency management happens in stages. So we have preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And mitigation is far and away the most cost-effective stage of disaster management. This is upgrading communities' infrastructure to withstand floods, upgrading storm management systems, making infrastructure resilient to what we know is coming in terms of disasters. And in New Orleans' case, this would have been fortifying levees. And how much did that cost after Katrina? It cost $15 billion when those levees were fortified, compared to $125 billion that the storm caused in damages. So we know that this is the most proactive and cost-effective form of mitigation that saves lives and saves money. And yet this is where Trump is really making huge cuts to our emergency preparedness in the US. He's cut the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, and he's halted funding for the bipartisan infrastructure law, both of which put billions towards upgrading communities' infrastructure to withstand climate-driven disasters. And in halting or cutting those programs, he's called them politicized. He said that, or his administration's officials have said that they inject a social justice agenda into infrastructure decisions, when in reality, what they did was prioritize grant funding to communities that were disadvantaged or didn't have the resources to prepare themselves. They prioritized low-income communities with less of a tax base and less of an ability to upgrade their infrastructure on a state-funded or locally funded level. I think that's a smart thing to do, but apparently
Yeah.
the administration considers that politicized, and thus we've lost out on the ability to proactively mitigate against disasters. And I think that that was another huge lesson from Katrina.
In addition to everything you're saying, I mean, Trump and his officials have been outright attacking FEMA. And we've had a lot of people who've been fired from FEMA, as a matter of fact. The agency has been gutted. And as we are taping today, we are heading into the heart of hurricane season. So what do you worry about as we go deeper into hurricane season, as natural disasters become more frequent and more intense as a result of climate change? What do you see as the worst case scenario?
Yeah, there's a lot of concerns I have. I think what you mentioned about staffing cuts is really important. We've not only FEMA, but also the National Weather Service, all of these federal agencies that are really critical to our country's backbone of emergency preparedness and response, have seen a lot of their really experienced staff who have spent their careers preparing to help our country prepare pushed out of these agencies. And we still have a hiring freeze. So all of these talented young people who are coming up, who might be graduating from programs with a huge level of expertise and talent, are likely not going to go into the government and assist in preparing our communities. So staff cuts and the loss of this expertise that we know we need is huge. We've got holes in our system to forecast and respond to disasters, absolutely. I think another thing that I don't mention too much in the piece because it was a bit off topic, but climate rollbacks. We're seeing increasing storms and disasters increasing in both frequency and severity because of man-made climate change. and yet we are turning away from the green energy transition. We are um, we are entirely halting our collaboration with the international community through the Paris Climate Accords. And so this is looking like 4 years of lost time on the most critical problem facing the generations to come. And we're going to see more storms because of it. I think also, we've talked about the proactive mitigation and the funding that we had toward that, those billions of dollar pools that were going to support communities' infrastructure upgrades. Beyond that, we're also going to have a lack of data. The NOAA has stopped tracking the number of the costs of storms. So we're not going to know how many billion-dollar disasters we're having a year, where the last two we've seen record-setting numbers of billion-dollar disasters. We're not going to have that data anymore. And the administration has also taken down web tools that show what climate risks are going to look like specifically for lower income communities, what their biggest hazards are, and where their infrastructure is weak, water and transport infrastructure that's really crucial to natural disasters. And without data, you can't make policy that responds to the situation on the ground. You can't make effective policy. So we're going to see some really big data gaps.
Yeah. Yeah. And the recklessness of this administration is staggering. It's really beyond
Mhm.
belief. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Gillian, for talking about your piece and bringing your perspective to this. My name is Ann Kim, Senior Editor at the Washington Monthly, and my guest today has been Gillian Tenner Martin. Thank you so much, and thank you all for watching. Take care.